Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to do a colored pencil drawing of a winter sunset. I'm going to use Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and I'm going to be working on 1000 grit wet to dry sandpaper. First I'm going to do a quick sketch with a graphite pencil. I'm going to divide the scene roughly into two parts. After that I need to determine the position of the sun. It's going to be slightly more to the left. After that I am starting to work on the sky. I'm going to use some violet and purplish tones, which is not something I normally do, but this scene will be a little bit different. So I picked up this manganese violet, and that's going to be my base color for the sky and for much of this scene. First I covered this part of the background thoroughly with this pencil. And then, after that was done, I started blending with a brush. To blend it properly, there are two things that you need to do. First, the brush should be a harder brush. Use a stiff bristle brush. And the second thing is that you need to have a sufficient amount of material on the paper in order to be able to blend. In the top part of the scene and around the edges I'm using this purplish blue. This is a slightly darker color. Now if you look at the base color or the background color of the paper, it's like a mid-tone gray, and in terms of value it's not that different from the violet that I used. So it was not that difficult to overcome the background color. But the purplish blue that I used at the top is a little bit darker, and I wanted it that way because I wanted the part of the scene which is further away from the light source to be darker and darker. Naturally, I need to try to make a smooth transition between the two, which is why I'm patiently layering the pencils and blending them every now and then. Once again, in order for this to work, you need to make sure that you have a sufficient amount of material on the paper, because if you spread it too thin, too much of the background color will be revealed. I'm introducing some pinkish tones here closer to the setting sun, because that's where the sky will be getting a bit lighter and a bit warmer in color. Here I used a little bit of salmon. Salmon is also a pinkish color, I suppose, but a bit lighter and a bit warmer. It has a bit of a yellowish component to it. And of course, I always blend. Every time I introduce a new layer, I do a little bit of blending. Like I said, these harder bristle brushes, they tend to work better, because they push the pigment into the grain of the paper, but you have to be careful not to overdo it, because then you will be digging the pigment out of the paper and out of that tooth and revealing the background color of the paper. So you need to use a moderate amount of pressure and blending. I put a little bit of cadmium orange, but that was a little bit too dark, so I decided to go with this lighter yellowish orange around the setting sun. That's going to give me that warmer tone, lighter tone around the sun, around that light source. And for the sun itself I'm going to use some very light colors. I'm going to use some ivory and a little bit of light yellowish color around the edge, and a bit of white colored pencil in the middle. So by layering these, I am trying to achieve a glowing effect, where the middle is the brightest and then the edges are a little bit less bright and a little bit more yellowish. And of course the sky around it that is illuminated or influenced by this light source is going to be both lighter and warmer in color. And I have to blend this as well. But here I have to be careful not to go over the sun too much so that I don't cover those lighter areas. Again, I'm working with some salmon because I thought that it would make a nice transition between the violet and the pinkish tones and these warmer yellowish tones in the middle. And I think it's doing the trick. For all of this you need pencils which are fairly sharp in order to blend and layer efficiently, and also to minimize the amount of texture, because whenever you apply the pencil it will create a little bit of texture in combination with the tooth of the paper, but you can always soften that with a brush, which is what I do every now and then, as you can see. So I'm just smearing that light, and here I decided to make the top part and the sides a little bit darker by adding a touch of black and then a bit of that purplish blue on top of it. So I wanted to make this part of the scene a bit darker and a bit duller. If you look at the reference, which is in the description as usual, you will see that it's a little bit darker, but that's okay, it doesn't have to be the same. I'm adding some of these bright yellowish tones around the sun. These are the edges of some of the clouds which are illuminated by the sun. The edge of these small shapes which is catching that warm light. So basically I'm making suggestions of these clouds or parts of the clouds which are illuminated, and the further away that I move away from the light source, the more I'm going to need this pinkish color. So I'm using the salmon to indicate those shapes of illuminated clouds, and a little bit of pink here at the top. You can also partly eliminate the texture by layering the pencils one on top of the other. That also creates a blending effect, especially if you use lighter ones on top of the darker ones. But I still think that you need to use some kind of a blending tool to soften the texture so that it will look a bit more realistic and a bit smoother, because it is the sky, so it shouldn't have too much, you shouldn't allow that illusion of detail in there, like for example when you're drawing terrain or ground or foliage or stuff like that, where you actually want to see more texture. I'm going back in and adding a little bit more white to the sun to make it brighter, because it got muddied a little bit as I was blending. And if you're surprised by how easily I can add lighter details on top of the darker layers, that's because of the sanded paper. Colored pencils behave completely differently on sandpaper than they do on regular paper. They're actually more like pastel pencils on this surface. Anyway, I'm starting to work on these trees on the horizon. So there's going to be a slope here. I actually increased the slope of the terrain a little bit to make it more asymmetrical in comparison to the reference. I just liked it better this way. I think it will be a bit more interesting. Now as for the trees, I will vary their size a little bit, because I don't want a straight line or a straight row of trees on the horizon. I want it to be a little bit more irregular. So some of them are going to be a little bit closer to our viewpoint than others, and some of them are going to be a little bit larger than others. So here on the left side I'm drawing a slightly taller one, which is clearly a bit closer to our viewpoint. And as I'm drawing it, I'm obviously putting in a little bit more effort into the details. These are coniferous trees like fir trees, and I'm trying to create that tapering conical shape that they usually have. Sometimes as I add new layers to the scene, as I add new objects, some of the objects that I drew previously, they will be overwritten or overdrawn, but that's just the way it goes. You don't really know exactly where you will place every single element. I'm adding some lighter details to the trees to make it look like they're covered with snow. Now here I'm adding another taller tree. This one is also a little bit closer, but not as close as the one to the left. The ones in the back are fairly simple shapes, so I just draw the vertical line and a little bit of horizontal lines to imitate the appearance of that conical canopy. But with the ones that are closer to us, I have to put in a bit more effort and draw a little bit more detail, more of those branches, more of the clusters of needles growing on them and stuff like that. I want one here in front of the setting sun, and the top of it will be a little bit lighter because it's influenced by that light source behind it, while the base, the lower part, will be a little bit darker. I thought that a darker shape against that sun would make for a nice contrast. But the scene in general has a very nice contrast because this entire row of trees on the horizon is like a single darker shape, which creates a nice contrast and tension with a brighter background. The background, by the way, is a lot lighter than that group of trees, but overall the scene is fairly dark in my opinion. It's mostly duller, cooler, darker colors, with the sun being the only really bright, lighter detail, and that's one of the things I liked about the scene. I knew that color pencils are generally not very good when covering larger areas, but when the target color is not that different from the background color, it's actually a lot easier to cover larger areas. So here I knew that even though the gray color is a lot different in tone than or in warmth than the colors that I was going to use on top of it, it wasn't that different in terms of the value, so I knew that it wouldn't be that difficult to overcome that background color. The only part where I needed to put a little bit more pressure and use a bit more pigment was the part around the sun, where I needed to cover that darker background color of the paper a bit more thoroughly. There's going to be another very tall tree, large tree here on the right side. This one is closest to our viewpoint, I think, and it's going to be the largest tree in my scene. I'm drawing a vertical line here to indicate the shape of the tree trunk and the size and the height of the tree. And now I'm just going to keep adding these branches and clusters of foliage on the sides. The branches in the middle and at the top are kind of pointing a little bit upwards or curving a little bit upwards, whereas the ones which are lower down are drooping down. That's because they are longer and heavier, and also because they are covered with snow. I also want some parts of that tree trunk and that canopy to be a little bit darker than others, because in some of them we're going to have some deeper shadows where there is less light coming through. And on top of all that, I'm going to add some lighter details with a light cool grey. I can't use the white because that would be too bright. Even though it's snow, it's still in the shadow, so even a white surface that is in the shadow can't be completely white. It needs to be a little bit darker. So here we're getting a slightly darker greyish, cooler greyish color for the snow. And I want some of these lighter details to make it look like some of the snow was left there on those branches. I'm adding a little bit of pinkish color on that snow as well, because I want it to look like the color of the snow is influenced by that environment, by that setting. So I think these lighter details are making the tree look a lot more complex. And now I'm adding some more trees on the right side. These are again a little bit bigger than the ones in the middle. They're a little bit closer to our viewpoint. Not quite as big as the one to the left of them, but I'm going to make them fairly detailed. And I also need to draw some smaller shapes behind them as well. Here I'm starting to work on the bottom portion of the scene, and I'm going to use very similar colors that I used at the top. First the violet, and then a little bit of purplish blue. I know that some people will complain that I didn't write down the numbers of the pencils that I used, but I can't be bothered to do that, and different people will see or perceive different colors in a different way, so it's very unlikely that you will, if you try to draw this scene, it's very unlikely that you will replicate the exact same colors or that you will achieve the same colors. Maybe yours will be better, who knows. I'm adding a little bit of lighter color here around the middle, because that part of the scene is influenced by that setting sun, the light from the setting sun. So I'm going to make it a little bit lighter, and I'm going to make the edges, which are further away from the light source, a bit darker. I keep switching back and forth between layering with pencils and blending with a brush. And I'm adding a little bit of shadow under some of these trees because I want to integrate them into the scene, show that they are interacting with that light source, and maybe a few random shadows here and there to show some variations and irregularities in that snowy terrain. A little bit more lighter details with a salmon colored pencil in the middle, and a little bit of pink, because I want to show how the light is illuminating this middle part of that snowy ground. And here on the right side I decided to add some tracks or footsteps in the snow, kind of similar to what we see in the reference, but I'm going to make them a little bit different. I used a black colored pencil and a little bit of blue on top of that. And I'm going to use a little bit of pinkish color here on the sides to to make them look a bit more three-dimensional, to make it look like this part here is a little bit raised, a little bit lighter. The scene is done. I'm putting my signature in the lower left corner. So I hope you like it. We have slightly different colors this time. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and for longer videos and more content, check out my Patreon. Bye bye.